in this time as where it's kind of a season of hopeful expectation. To me, it really reminds me of many of the early Christians who were very much in that same kind of mindset. A lot of the early Christians had the mindset that Christ was coming, the second coming was gonna be within their lifetimes, and that it was just something that was imminent, which is a great mindset to kind of live with, because if you have this idea that his second coming is imminent, then you're gonna probably be a little bit more in the mindset of being pleasing to God, and to avoiding sin, and to being really rooted in your beliefs and your faith, which is something that early Christians definitely had to be, because there was a lot of persecution going on. Most of us have heard of the Catacombs, and maybe not too many of us know really what the Catacombs are, but this was a place somewhat of refuge for early Christians. It's an interesting idea, kind of one of the early examples of how Christianity is countercultural and always contradicts what society and culture says, because this was a place of death and of horror. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm your host, Peter, and I have with me my brother, JP. Got JP in the house. We're the Pinedo Brothers, Catholic filmmaking artists, working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through stories about faith, not just faith films. So it's an exciting time. This is the beginning of the Advent season. There's a lot of hopeful expectation going on. We're all preparing for the season of Christmas. And there's a lot going on in the world too. And there's a lot going on with the Pinedo Brothers. So let's talk about it all. Let's get on. Let's get right into it. You got any beginning comments? Anything to say for the good listeners, JP?
I want to say thank you all for tuning in so much to the Puritan roots of the woke movement. That was we got a lot of great feedback from that one, which really excites me. And how about at the end of this current conversation, where we're talking, I think, about the Catacombs, right, Peter? We go through and read a comment or two. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good. And I guess we shouldn't be too surprised that a lot of people really connected with that episode, because it is, I think, that kind of message really resounds with people, that this time of kind of going back to what we can appreciate about Thanksgiving and about our culture and our society, but also seeing the deeper underlying kind of philosophies and things that have contributed and led us to where we are today. That's history. That's actually what history is all about, like seeing the roots and the reasons to how we got to where we are today. It's not just a collection of names and places and dates. That's how everyone always seems to think of it as. But that's my history rant. But yes, for last week we celebrated Thanksgiving, and this past Sunday, we celebrated the first Sunday in Advent, which, if you're not Catholic, or if you're not too familiar with the season of Advent, it's a time of the 4 Sundays before Christmas, a time when we are, as Catholics, very much preparing ourselves and preparing our hearts for the coming of Christ in Christmas. And it's kind of meant originally, I think, to be a little bit of a somewhat of a penitential season, and a season of really examining yourself and spending a lot of time in quiet and solitude, and really kind of in quiet prayer with God. To me, it really reminds me of many of the early Christians. Most of us have heard of the Catacombs. This was a place somewhat of refuge for early Christians. It's a catacombs. What they are is they're just immense networks underneath cities. In ancient Rome, they would either bury the people way far out of the city, or they would cremate them, or they would dig beneath ground, because death is associated with disease, and they didn't want to be exposed to these, the dead and the disease that they bring with them. So they would dig down beneath the city, and they created these vast labyrinths lasting, going for miles and miles, just full of, along the very thin, very dark kind of corridors, and on either side there are bodies of the dead buried in these little crypts, in these little tombs. And they're not buried at all with very much pomp and circumstance. Many were just kind of frantically and very unceremoniously put in there. And of course, it was a couple of thousand years ago, so these are most of these people are no longer identifiable, and we don't know who they are, but many, many, many of them were martyrs. And after they would be martyred, mauled by lions and burned at the stake, and all these different ways that early Christians suffered at the hands of their persecutors. Oftentimes, Christians would be able to go and recover their bodies and give them a bit of a burial, and they would oftentimes be buried inside of these catacombs. But so this kind of became a little bit of a place of refuge for Christians, because it was the last place that Roman citizens would want to be going down and, just wandering down there for no reason. They would only ever go there if it was a very specific reason, to bury someone mainly. And so oftentimes Christians would go beneath ground into the catacombs, and that's where they would celebrate the Mass, or they would worship together. And oftentimes they would actually celebrate the Mass. They'd make the altar on top of one of the tombs of one of these martyrs. And that's a tradition that we carry on today as Catholics. We all always put the relic of a saint or a martyr beneath our altar, and that altar is where we offer the sacrifice of the Mass. So it's really a beautiful reminder, I think, as we begin this Advent season, of how we are rooted in the hope of the coming of Christ. And even in these dark, and they were very dark, very damp, and very gloomy kind of subterranean corridors and networks. But here is where the faithful could come together and worship together and be just in complete hope and joy, oftentimes, in the midst of persecution, celebrating the Mass together.
Well, it seems like a great setting for a story, which catches my interest quite a bit as an artist, of course. But tell me, what caught your interest connecting this to Advent itself?
Well, I think that, to me, the joy of Christ's coming, and the joy of Christmas, and the joy of his second coming are really, they're very much tied into suffering. And I think that suffering as something that is meaningful is an idea that is rejected today. And it's very much put aside, kind of like how Roman society would want to put aside this idea of death and not think about it. And that's why they wouldn't go down to the catacombs. But the Christians and the Christianity has this idea that death is, the beginning of a new life. And I think that's what we're looking at today as we begin Advent, as this is the beginning of a new liturgical year. For Catholics, the Advent begins the new liturgical year.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year. But this is an idea, I think, that can really connect with people. And because it's, I think, a hopeful message that this is not all that there is. And that Christmas is not something that's meant to be kind of a empty and shallow, like, bright lights and family at times, but then, at the end of it, you're like, oh, I'm so glad that's over, because it was so stressful and there was so much going on. That's a complete, like, shallowing, or just kind of disemboweling pretty much the meaning of Christmas and what it can mean to us. And so I think that as artists, we also have this ability to be able to communicate, and communicate these ideas in a way that is able to reach other people. Even in the catacombs, in the midst of this persecution and suffering, you go down to the catacombs in Rome. Many of them are richly decorated. They're not as elaborate as the later Gothic cathedrals would end up being, but they poured themselves into that as well. Still, they many of them have frescoes and are decorated beautifully in the Roman fashion, and so it's kind of testifying to, I think, really the joy and that can come from living a life for God and not for just yourself, if that makes sense.
Doesn't that put us to shame? Like, if you think about it, we have these early Christians, and I'm picturing, they're getting persecuted on all sides, and they want to celebrate the liturgy. They want to celebrate, the great mystery of perhaps Christ's birth, like maybe the Christmas as a practice that I'm not sure when it was founded, but it might not have been founded during the time of the Great Roman Persecution. So they might not have celebrated specifically like we do on December 25th, Christmas Day, but they're celebrating Christ's birth at some point for sure. And so I just imagine them going down into these tombs, into the crypts. And what do? They beautify these tombs and these crypts. And what do we have? We celebrate the sacrifice of the Mass openly, everywhere. At any moment in the day in our country, we're blessed to have the sacrifice of the Mass. And yet the churches that we have, are oftentimes the brutalistic style. What do we do?
The cathedral in LA.
Yeah. We take all of this money that we have and we pour them into making a meeting room. And the early Christians took all of their passion and they poured it into making a crypt a beautiful place to celebrate the liturgy. Like, what in the world? What have we done? Where have we lost the way?
Yeah. And I think that's the more that we realize that and are conscious of it as Catholics, the more that we're going to be able to connect with the culture at large. Because I think there's a hunger and there's a thirst for in society, in secular society, for beauty, and so the more that we are kind of returning to that idea as Catholics and Christians, that we should be giving our best and and using our artistic talents as much as we can for the glory of God, I think the more we'll see people returning to the Christian and Catholic faith. So I think it's an important thing to think of. Yeah, when you were talking about the brutalist kind of churches, when I think of brutalist churches, literally the first thing that comes to mind is the cathedral in LA, which literally to me, it just reminds me of 2049 Blade Runner. Like that's exactly what I think of. But even less brutal, there's many churches that are just very plain, and simplicity is not a bad thing. You can be very artistic and beautiful in a simple way, but there are some that are like they are just made to be kind of, I guess, maybe have a countercultural movement to what a church, I think there was in the 60s and 70s, is kind of like we want to redefine what a church looks like. But even in the design, I think we've spoken about it before, the design of churches has theology behind it. Like the cruciform, oftentimes many of the churches would be in the cruciform, and even some of the other designs had theology and theological ideas kind of embedded in the physical structure of the church. And you see that too with the catacombs. I was kind of reading up on them a little bit more, and the catacombs, like the early Christians, most of them were kind of on the poorer side. They were simpler, and they were the first really to kind of accept Christianity, at least in Rome. And so they didn't have a lot, but what they had, they poured into even in the catacombs, and they painted the walls quite beautifully. And you see some of the earliest depictions of the Virgin Mary and of Christ as the Good Shepherd in the catacombs. So like that's pretty cool to think of as Christianity today has spread all over the world. You see massive cathedrals and just millions of people professing the Christian faith. But some of the very earliest examples of of Christian symbology is found in these cold, damp corridors beneath the city of Rome. So it's pretty cool, and I think like you were saying, there's a lot of room for storytelling right here.
Oh, absolutely. So we've spent a few things here. What else can we learn from this, and how can we connect it to this time of Advent? Because what I'm sensing is you're helping us use this time, these next few weeks, as preparing for Christmas. And it's a bit of a meditation here that you're giving me about how I can think about these catacombs, remember these early Christians before, long before there were any type of church revolution, even before there was Arianism. This is just the very beginning, going back to what they knew so well. They knew so well that they were willing to get thrown to the lions for it. So you're helping us remember what the early Christians saw right in front of their faces as we prepare for Christmas. What else can we learn from these early Christians?
I mean, I think what you were saying is really important too, because this is very much it's a physical depiction of the church underground, because it's literally underground, and that's also a reality that we face today, even as modern 21st century people, even sometimes in some cases in America. Where you're forced to be secretive about your Christian beliefs, or else you'll be cast aside or cast out and not accepted in your workplace or your social circles. And I think that as Christians, we have to remember that none of this is new. It's literally thousands of years old, and since the first Christians, there were people persecuting and forcing it underground. And so as we kind of go through this Advent season, I think this is a really important season that we kind of oftentimes just kind of overlook. And which is understandable, because we're excited for Christmas, and we should be excited for Christmas because it's the most wonderful time of year. And actually, I do believe that I say Christmas is my favorite holiday. But I think it's made better by the season of Advent. So I think it's important as Christians that we don't forget that. So yeah, I think really what I'm saying is that it's this idea of the church underground and the church within the catacombs is something that we can really reflect on, because the most important relationship that we can have, I think, is a personal relationship with God. And that's something that occurs internally, where we reflect it in our lives in a visible and physical manner by our actions, carrying out our love for God. But actions, without faith and without the love of God are empty, And so I think that the catacombs really embodies very much this returning to God internally, kind of reflecting on your relationship with God. And that's really what the Advent season, I think, is all about. Kind of focusing on God's promise and God's love for you and your love for God, and then reflecting that out to the world. And then when Christmas comes, it's kind of a coming out of the catacombs to celebrate the liberty and the freeness of our faith. Kind of like when Constantine allowed Christianity to be practiced in the Roman Empire. Finally, the faith could come out from underneath the ground and explode into a new season of joy and of spreading of the faith. And so that's kind of a similar idea to, I think, that we want to be reflecting our love of God in our actions, and we want to be showing the world through our actions that we are Christians.
Yeah.
But we cannot do that without first going inward and building that relationship with God.
Very true. However, if we do not get to that second part, we're going to be heading back to the catacombs permanently. I think it's a good time to remember that unless our actions reflect outward our faith, the ability for us to practice that faith outwardly will be taken away. In the public sphere, we have a need for our faith, or else we have a need to practice our faith in the public sphere, or else we no longer will be able to. And you're seeing that happen right now in so many parts of the world. Actually, to be a little bit radical, I think that, and you're having so many wonderful points. I almost hate to be a Debbie Downer here, but I want to say that you talking about the catacombs is a warning to me that we need to look out, because the church has been underground. The Catholic Church has been underground here in the United States before. It could be that way again very easily. Mm. And you probably disagree with me here, but the actions that our bishops have been taking recently, like shutting down the church at the behest of the government authorities, has, I think, sped up the timeline for an oncoming persecution. I'm hopeful. I mean, nothing's set in stone. I hope that timeline gets dramatically shifted. But we're seeing today with this Protection of Marriage Act that the timeline keeps getting sped up.
Yeah. I mean, I could definitely see what you're saying. I think that I would agree in that many governments across the world, including the United States, have kind of got a taste for ultimate power.
Yep.
In the lockdowns.
Yep.
And in the United States, I think that you have governments realizing we actually can control the practice of religion, which is a very, scary and radical kind of idea in itself. And unfortunately, I think that there's kind of a, there's many that are okay with that. They're very kind of complicit with that. And so I think that it's definitely hearkening. We're moving towards a time when there will have to be much true heroism within the church in order for it to continue, even here in the United States. And the history of the United States is very interesting when it comes to Catholicism, because it's very, complicated and nuanced. Yeah, because
the history is always that way. History's never black and white.
Right.
It's a great country, but we have a checkered history with the Catholic faith.
Right. So many of the founding fathers of the United States were vehemently anti-Catholic. And so many of the patriots who founded this nation were vehemently anti-Catholic. But at the same time, you also had like the Carrolls who were great Catholics who were fighting just alongside them as patriots to found this nation. So it's kind of, we think of it as modern Americans very much we've evolved pretty much past the stage of those kind of issues, of those problems. But it's not something that we're immune to, and it's not something we have been immune to.
Right, exactly. And then we can see examples firsthand. Well, the common thing, the one that everyone talks about right now, and we should talk about it more actually, is China. But it's happening in the Middle East as well. I mean, I'm not even sure. We need to ask our New Zealand friends if they're able to go to church, or how long they weren't able to. Like New Zealand the lockdowns were draconian. And I'm not equating New Zealand to China or the Middle East, but this is a problem. This is a very problematic trend that's surfacing all over the globe, is authoritarianism that's crunching down on the freedom of religion everywhere, and other freedoms at the same time. What do you point to what comes to mind when you think about and you look around the world and see the practice of religion becoming under attack?
Well, I think really the biggest thing that does come to mind is China, because in my mind, it's a perfect example of you have a very powerful overarching government that is clamping down on the practice of Catholicism and has established its own, state version of Catholicism.
Right.
And it's really interesting to see because the Vatican has been placed in this very awkward position where it's trying to facilitate the Catholics in China being able to continue the practice of their religion, but also having to say, kind of like you have this almost feudal problem where it's the state saying like, all right, we're going to appoint this bishop and we're making this diocese over here and doing this. And the church is like, no, you can't do that. And so there's an underground church, very much as there was an underground church in Rome. There's an underground church in China with underground bishops and Catholics in the practice of Mass beneath this very technological and advanced authoritarian government that we have in China. So that is, I think, really the most dramatic kind of showcasing of what could happen in the United States if things were to get to that point. And just the modern example of what the Christian Romans must have had to deal with facing those persecutions. Because of course we also have the Middle East, but I think there's a little bit more disorganized, and it's the plight that Christians face there is horrible. I mean, Christians are being beheaded in the hundreds and thousands, I think, in the Middle East. But what we see in China is really is something that we as Americans really should look to and take a hard look at it and really kind of do some of that internalizing to figure out what we're willing to do for our faith.
Right. And then also I was listening to my current congressman. They're redistricting us, so it's sad that he's not going to be my current congressman for very much longer. Congressman Crenshaw. And he was talking about how wargaming is an important part of every person's life. Like, you should be prepping for every day as if it was a battle, like how can you put yourself in the headspace of what could possibly go wrong. And you as a soldier, I'm sure, know this much better than I. Let's do a little wargaming, because I think what's difficult about living your faith in the public sphere is that it's always we're always surprised. We're always taken unawares, and it's almost like, oh my gosh, I'm not prepared to talk about this. I'm not prepared to speak on this. What do you see as the most pressing threat here in the United States that could lead us back to the catacombs, to being a church underground? I'm speaking figuratively, not literally. Church underground. We don't have catacombs under Houston, so that's not going to work for us. But
that would be a real surprise, though. I mean, it would be the last thing to expect.
That would be the last thing I would expect. So what could lead us down China's road? Like, where do you see the battle is? Like, for example, the Defense of Marriage Act could be something there. But how can we speak out and find a way to live our faith better in the public life?
Well, I think that really what we see and really need to speak to is anytime that culture and society and the government is kind of are assuming the role of religion, of Christianity in people's lives. And really that's what socialism is it's a religion, and that's why socialist governments always have to crack down on the practice of any other religion, because it is a religion that you have to accept, and it is the totality of a person's life. And so I think that, of course, the lockdowns during COVID is a perfect example of what shouldn't happen and what we as Americans have to be able to reject. And I think that the government now in many ways is going to continue to kind of chip away at our religious freedom and just kind of be testing the limits of what we're willing to accept and kind of just take with just take and roll over and take. I think certain kinds of mandates that violate our conscience, maybe with regard to abortion. They'll mandate something that is violates our conscience, and we're not okay with doing or participating in as Catholics. And they say, no, you have to do it anyway. I think that's something you probably need to stand up against, and not be willing to kind of take and just roll over. I think St. Thomas More is a great example of that, where he looked for every other avenue, the ways that he could make this work. But when it came down to it, he realized that the king is trying to assume the role of God almost, basically, and he couldn't comply with that. And so when there was no other option, he had to respectfully decline to participate and to be complicit in that. And I think we find ourselves very often today, as Americans, as Catholic Americans, facing very similar situations that St. Thomas More did, and for which he was eventually beheaded.
Right. Well, I think the perfect example of all of this coming to all of our doorsteps here in the United States, and this Advent is a good time to remember that we need to build up the personal life, the personal interior life, to be able to confront this approaching menace that's coming closer to us and closer to us, is the corporate life. If the corporate world has completely embodied the ideas that, well, are contrary to our Catholic faith about abortion, about same-sex marriage. I mean, know why the church defines marriage as between one man and one woman. Like why do we say that? We should be speaking about that very clearly, or we should be able to speak about that very clearly. We should know why the church defines life as precious from the moment of conception. That's a very contentious argument now in our corporate world. Or for why is there a binary of there's a man and there's woman? Why are these pronouns problematic? All of these things, putting your pronouns in your email signature, all of these things we need to be prepared to speak about. And all of these things are now being thrust upon us in our corporate life. You thought, what's the old saying? Don't bring your religion into this. Well, we've been pretty good about honoring that. We haven't brought our religion into it. But now there's another religion that's been brought into that vacuum. And so we have a choice here: either lose our own that we've held privately, or hold it publicly. And that's kind of what we're faced with right now. So yeah.
No, I think that it's an important time, especially during Advent, to realize what we're facing and what we will face if we're not willing to take action now. So
absolutely,
I think that's really important.
Maybe I know we're running short. We had a late start. Any parting thoughts on Advent?
Well, I think we'll get to speak a little bit more about Advent as we have 4 weeks
about the Catacombs.
The Catacombs, I think for me, it's kind of a perfect reflection to begin off this Advent season, because it is a time of quiet reflection and hopeful anticipation of God's coming. And ultimately, what we face today is the same thing. We face persecutions and trials and tribulations that we might face, but we are all waiting for the second coming. And I think that's a really hopeful and joyful message to have in your heart.
It is incredibly joyful. And I think you've challenged me with this interior life. I'm going to make a point to be reading the Church Fathers in the morning. I've got a bit of a cold right now, so it makes things problematic to do anything because my brain is a little slow. But I think we have such a treasure to draw upon with Polycarp and Augustine and Aquinas, all these great Jerome, all these great thinkers that they're at our fingertips now. We can read them at any time we want. Let's make, I'm going to try and make a point to start reading our church fathers so that we're able to understand the reasons behind church teaching a little bit better, especially this Advent. Well, anyway, thank you for that meditation. Perhaps we go through a couple of comments, or maybe just one. We'll see. There's two comments that I really like. We'll go one really short and then maybe one another a little bit longer. What do you think?
Let's do it. Let's hear from the people.
So we had a comment, and I'm so excited about this, from an Arian. Well, remember how we talked about the Arian heresy? I mentioned it in passing. So I'm just going to read the comment verbatim because it was so fascinating to me. You guys really need to check out Puritan sermons. Catholics are woke worshiping Mary, the mother of the human body of Jesus Christ, God incarnate. Well, I just had to take a moment to appreciate it. That was from VMAG. So,
it is an Arian idea. Yeah, look at that.
Yeah, it's completely Arian. Also, it's self-contradictory because, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't incarnate? Doesn't that mean fleshed? So if someone says God incarnate, doesn't that mean flesh in fleshed? So isn't that a contradiction? So first you're saying like Mary, the mother of God. Well, no, I'm sorry. Mary, that was a Catholic phrase. You're saying Mary, the mother of the human body. So saying that the human body is separate from God. But then if you say then God is incarnate, doesn't that destroy the separation? At least in my mind. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm being unfair to VMAG. But what I wanted to say here is that old heresies never completely die. And this is an example here of that. I guess this VMAG must be a Puritan or appreciate Puritanism. And I wasn't aware that the Arian heresy had infiltrated Puritanism, and which separates God from the body of Jesus Christ. There's this weird duality that says that Jesus, the body of Jesus, was not God, but there is the Son. It's almost kind of like it was a meat puppet sort of thing that was being controlled.
Almost like a possession of the human body.
Right. And so therefore Mary was not the mother of God, is what the Arian heresy did. And the great proclamation of Theotokos of the early, I think the Council of Nicaea, correct? Where it condemned the Arian heresy and proclaimed that the bishops gathered as into a college of bishops and spoke ex cathedra with the power of the Holy Spirit behind them, and said that no, Mary is Theotokos, the mother of God. And the church in mass just celebrated, because the Arian heresy was a heresy of the elite, just like we experience right now, where the elites are the ones that are pushing down this modern attack. And it was it was the you and me of the church that were recognizing the doctrine of Theotokos before the church actually proclaimed it officially, that Mary was the mother of God. So this is a great moment to remember. I appreciate VMAG. I don't agree with you. I do think it's worth checking out Puritan sermons, but just because it's good to know what heretics have to say. Okay.
I would be interested in, I don't know if, what was his name? VMAG?
Yeah.
I don't know if he's going to be listening to this episode, but if he is, if he could leave a comment to a couple of Puritan sermons or preachers that he would like us to listen to, that would be appreciated. Oh, okay, he did. Okay,
yeah,
we should look that up.
Yeah, you should check it out. Okay, moving on. Wokeism is not a form of Puritanism. It's a form of medievalism. This is from Raoul. Sorry, Raoul 2. Ratul. I guess that's what it is. Ratul. Wokeism is not a form of Puritanism. It's a form of medievalism. It's an
That's
inquisition that makes up laws on the spot so it can condemn on the spot. This is super interesting to me. This comment I really, really like.
Whew. All right.
The wokeism is not a form of Puritanism. Okay. That's the first part of that argument. It's a form of medievalism. Okay. So the first thing that I have right there is that's quite a reduction. If all of the medieval period and all its movements can be boiled down into wokeism, wokeism is a lot bigger than we give it credit for. That's the thing about these ideologies, is that ultimately they're very simple. The medieval period is anything but simple. It is incredibly rich and varied. So, okay, we passed that over. That's something I completely reject from the very beginning. And there's no historical basis for it, in fact, at all. Okay, here's the point that's really more interesting. It's an inquisition that makes up laws on the spot so it can condemn on the spot. So it's equating medievalism with the Inquisition, saying that those are equal to each other, and then it makes up laws on the spot. So you're saying then wokeism makes up laws on the spot so it can condemn on the spot. I actually agree with that. I think that wokeism is ever fluid and ever shifting, and it's whatever the moral betters at the top of the hierarchy have to say, or maybe not even have to say, what they feel at the time. Whatever our moral betters at the top of the hierarchy feel is what goes on from it. But the point that really interested me that I wanted to ask you about is there any, so we take the historical fact of the Inquisition. Are there any parallels that we can draw between the Inquisition and this woke movement?
I think because the follow-up question would be, which Inquisition is he referring to?
Right. That's really good. Everyone talks about the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah. And which I wouldn't really consider that medieval, because I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, that was a little bit past the medieval period.
Yeah, it's later, but that people don't know dates, don't know history. So let's speak about the Spanish Inquisition, because let's drop the whole medieval thing, because it really doesn't make any sense. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt here for Ratul.
In terms of the Spanish Inquisition, you have to really ask where your information is coming from.
From the English, of course.
Right. And that's an important thing to remember as Americans. The history that we read on the Spanish Inquisition does come from the English, who are the historic enemies of the Spanish and will do anything and say anything to make them look bad. So when we look at the historical account of the Spanish Inquisition for what it really was, it's something that I don't think we would want to experience or have today. But the scale of it, and it's this idea of them making up rules on the spot.
Yeah, that was interesting to me.
Very inaccurate.
Yeah, that kind of, I'm wondering where that we get that. Like, even the English accounts don't say that. I think the English accounts would condemn the Inquisition for being overly scrupulous and sticking to the rules of the day and the rules of the church. So I'm wondering where that comes from, actually, because that's kind of a surprise, even though I do think wokeism is definitely guilty of that, because the rules seem to constantly change.
Yeah, I think that there's actually a couple of saints, if I'm not mistaken, who were sent to the Inquisition for their ideas, and they were ultimately released.
Right.
Because it was based on rules and the laws and canon law, that when they actually went through and examined everything, they realized, oh, what they're saying is not against canon law or not against the faith. And so they ultimately had to release them. So I don't think that's accurate at all, unless what was the name of this person?
Ratul.
Yeah. Maybe if he could be more specific on exactly what he's meaning, that might be a little bit more insightful.
Good. Well, I think that
thank you, Ratul.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the English idea of the Inquisition, which is not accurate. I mean, for example, Nancy Pelosi's idea of church teaching It's not accurate. I think I would equate the English idea of the Inquisition about as closely as allied to fact as Nancy Pelosi's idea of what Catholic teaching is. So that is really not much at all. If you were to take that idea that the English, slandered the Spanish with, of the Spanish Inquisition, you probably even then wouldn't have a connection to wokeism, because the English were slandering like the Spanish, saying that they were overly draconian, sticking to their rules, closed off to new ideas, condemning to death left and right. And I think that's exactly the opposite of what the wokists are hoping to do. I mean, it's not, the wokists are not new, but they also are completely enthralled with the thought of being progressive, being the light bearer, and finding what is this new mode, what's the mode of the day, and how can we advance that new mode, which is really anathema to this idea that the English spread, that the Spanish Inquisition was doing. I want to find more connection, like you say, like maybe Ratul can tell us more about teach us about more about what the British wrote about the Spanish, so that we can know what kind of connection we have, besides that making up rules on the spot to condemn on the spot, which I think has no basis in anyone's account. So at any rate, I really enjoyed those comments. That was good. I hope we get more comments. I guess I'm not hoping for Arians to comment. I would like Catholics to comment, but still, any comment is appreciated. So
But maybe if you're an Arian and you hear this, tell your Catholic friends why you were so triggered by it, or annoyed, or actually enjoyed it. Tell them, and maybe y'all can have a nice discussion about Catholicism after they watch this podcast.
There we go. All right. Anyway, that's it for the mailbag.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So I appreciate y'all joining. Did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to close out with?
No, I think this is great. I look forward to continuing on our Advent journey. Next week, we'll be talking hopefully about transformative experiences and how we can look to put those into our own life this Advent.
Yes, absolutely. I'm looking forward to that conversation. I know we're going to have a good time, and I know y'all going to have a good time when you tune into us next time. Thank you, everyone. And we are the Pinedo Brothers, Catholic filmmakers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.